Good evening, everyone, and welcome to your favorite sleep channel, The Droning Professor. Tonight we're going to learn about Alan Turing, the man who taught machines to think. So as you make yourselves comfortable, please take a moment to let us know where you're listening from, and feel free to subscribe. Now, as always, take a moment for some deep breaths, letting your mind and body relax for a good night of sleep. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the extraordinary life of a man who changed the world twice over. Once, by helping to win the most devastating war in human history. And once again, by laying the foundation for the device you probably have in your pocket right now. His name was Alan Matheson Turing, and if you've never heard of him, well, that's part of the tragedy we'll be exploring tonight. But let me be clear from the start. This isn't going to be one of those dry, reverential biographical accounts where we treat our subject like a marble statue. Alan Turing was brilliant, yes, but he was also awkward, funny, eccentric, and deeply human. He ran marathons in terrible weather. He chained his coffee mug to the radiator because someone kept stealing it. He once tried to electroplate a spoon in his bedroom and nearly burned down his lodgings. This is a man who, when asked what he wanted for Christmas, replied, "I should like a half-pound of tea. Not a tie, not socks, tea." So tonight, we're going to laugh, we're going to marvel, and yes, we're going to feel the weight of injustice. Because Alan Turing's story is ultimately about genius meeting prejudice, about a man ahead of his time in every way, and about how a society can destroy the very person trying to save it. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Saw Patterns Everywhere. Alan Turing was born on June 23, 1912, in Maida Vale, London, which, if you're keeping track, means he entered the world right between the sinking of the Titanic and the start of the First World War. Timing, as we'll see, would become something of a theme in his life. His father, Julius, worked for the Indian Civil Service, which meant Alan and his older brother John spent much of their childhood being shuttled between boarding schools and foster families while their parents were abroad. Now, I know what you're thinking, classic British upper-middle-class neglect. And you're not entirely wrong, but here's the thing about young Alan: he was probably too busy being fascinated by everything around him to notice the loneliness too much. Picture this. A scrawny kid with a bowl cut, lying on his stomach in the garden, watching ants for hours. Not just watching them casually, mind you, but studying them, counting their legs, timing how long it took them to carry things, wondering if they had a system. This was a boy who, at age 6, tried to figure out whether bees could be persuaded to produce more honey if he left sugar cubes near their hives. Spoiler alert. The bees were not consulted about this arrangement and had mixed feelings. His parents worried about him. Of course they did. Here was their son who couldn't quite figure out how to tie his shoelaces properly, but could explain to you in elaborate detail why the spots on a cow weren't evenly distributed. He had atrocious handwriting, and I mean truly spectacular in its awfulness, but he'd create elaborate chemical experiments in his bedroom that frequently resulted in mysterious stains and concerning odors. When Alan was sent to Hazelhurst Preparatory School, his headmistress wrote to his mother, "I hope he will not fall between two stools." What she meant was that Alan seemed caught between the sciences and the humanities, unable to commit to being properly good at either. What she failed to recognize was that falling between two stools is sometimes the only way to see that there's a whole floor beneath them. But it was at Sherborne School, starting in 1926, where things got interesting. And by interesting, I mean difficult. Sherborne was one of those grand English public schools which, confusingly, means it was actually private, where rugby was considered more important than calculus, and being good at sports mattered more than being able to factor polynomials. Alan Turing was neither good at rugby nor particularly interested in pretending to be. His first day at Sherborne has become the stuff of legend. There was a general strike across Britain, and the trains weren't running, so what did 15-year-old Alan do? He got on his bicycle and rode 60 miles from Southampton to Sherborne. 60 miles. On a bicycle. Because missing the first day of school seemed unreasonable to him, but cycling all day apparently did not. The local newspaper actually covered this, running a story about the determined boy on his bike. Alan was mortified by the attention. This was a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. He'd do something remarkable, people would make a fuss, and he'd wonder what all the bother was about. At Sherborne, Alan fell in love. Not with rugby or Latin or any of the things the school valued, but with mathematics. And also, as it happens, with a boy named Christopher Morecambe. Now, we need to pause here because this is important. In 1926, being gay in England wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. Oscar Wilde had been destroyed by it just 30 years earlier. So when I say Alan fell in love, I mean he experienced something he couldn't discuss, couldn't acknowledge, and certainly couldn't act upon. Christopher Morecambe was everything Alan wasn't. Athletic, popular, conventionally handsome, and also, fortunately for their friendship, genuinely brilliant at mathematics. They bonded over astronomical observations, chemical experiments, and the kind of abstract mathematical problems that made their classmates' eyes glaze over. For Alan, who had spent most of his life feeling like an alien observing human society from the outside, Christopher was proof that he wasn't alone in the universe. They planned their futures together. They'd go to Cambridge. They'd continue their scientific work. They'd change the world, or at least figure out some interesting things about it. And then, in February of 1930, Christopher Morecambe died suddenly from bovine tuberculosis. Alan was devastated, absolutely shattered. He wrote to Christopher's mother, beginning a correspondence that would last for years, trying to make sense of the loss. In his grief, Alan grasped for something that might make Christopher's death less final. He became temporarily interested in quantum mechanics, wondering if consciousness might somehow persist in the universe. Could the mind exist independently of the body? Could information survive physical death? These were the questions of a heartbroken teenager trying to believe that someone he loved wasn't simply gone. But they were also the questions of a brilliant mind, beginning to grapple with what would become his life's work. The relationship between the physical and the abstract, between matter and information, between hardware and software. Christopher's death lit a fire under Alan. He threw himself into mathematics with renewed intensity, as if he could honor Christopher's memory by pursuing the work they might have done together. In 1931, he won a scholarship to King's College, Cambridge, to study mathematics. And that's where our story really begins. Chapter 2: Cambridge and the Birth of the Universal Machine. Cambridge in the 1930s was an intellectual playground. This was the Cambridge of Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein, where the smartest people in Britain gathered to argue about logic, philosophy, and the nature of reality itself. Alan Turing arrived there in 1931, still grieving Christopher, still awkward, still more interested in ideas than in social niceties. He thrived. At Cambridge, being obsessive about mathematics wasn't weird, it was expected. Being disheveled and distracted was practically a requirement. And Alan's particular brand of genius began to show itself. He wasn't interested in just solving problems. He was interested in understanding whether problems could be solved, and if so, what that actually meant. Let me paint you a picture of Cambridge Turing. He ran. A lot, often in the rain. Sometimes wearing a gas mask because he suffered from hay fever and running through pollen-filled air wasn't ideal. Imagine coming across this sight on a Cambridge pathway. A lanky mathematician in shorts, pounding along the towpath, wearing a gas mask, probably muttering to himself about logic. The locals must have thought the university was conducting some very strange experiments. He also rowed, though he was apparently quite terrible at it. His college, King's, was known for its excellent rowing teams. Alan managed to be on a crew that lost nearly every race. But he kept showing up, kept trying, kept being enthusiastically mediocre at coordinating his movements with 7 other people. This tells you something important about Alan. He didn't quit things just because he wasn't naturally good at them. But it was in mathematics that he was naturally brilliant. In 1935, at just 23 years old, Alan was elected a Fellow of King's College for a dissertation on probability theory. This was a big deal. Being a fellow meant he could stay at Cambridge, pursue his research, and be paid for the privilege of thinking deeply about mathematics. It was the dream. But here's where things get really interesting. That same year, Alan attended a series of lectures by the mathematician Max Newman on the foundations of mathematics. And in those lectures, Newman discussed something called the Entscheidungsproblem. Now, before your eyes glaze over, stay with me. The Entscheidungsproblem, which is German for decision problem but sounds much more intimidating, was one of the big questions in mathematics at the time. Essentially, it asked, is there a mechanical procedure that could take any mathematical statement and determine whether it's true or false? Think of it this way. You give me a mathematical statement like 2 plus 2 equals 4. True. You give me 2 plus 2 equals 5. False. Easy enough. But what about really complex mathematical statements involving thousands of variables and complicated relationships? Could there be some kind of systematic, step-by-step process, a kind of recipe that would always work to determine truth or falsehood? The great mathematician David Hilbert thought the answer was yes. He believed mathematics was complete and consistent, that every true statement could eventually be proven true, and every false statement could be proven false, using some mechanical procedure. But Alan Turing, sitting in those lectures, thought, what if we actually tried to imagine what such a mechanical procedure would look like? So he did something remarkable. He invented an imaginary machine. Now, to be clear, Alan wasn't thinking about building an actual physical device. He was doing what mathematicians do. He was creating an abstraction, a thought experiment. But this thought experiment would change the world. Here's what Alan imagined. Picture an infinitely long strip of tape divided into squares. Each square can either be blank or have a symbol written on it. Now imagine a simple mechanism that can do only a few things. Read the symbol in the current square. Write a symbol in the current square. Erase a symbol from the current square. Move one square to the left. Move one square to the right. Change its internal state based on what it reads. That's it. That's the whole machine. Ridiculously simple, right? A tape, a reading head, and a handful of basic operations. But here's the brilliant part. Alan showed that this absurdly simple machine, following a specific set of instructions, could perform any calculation that any computer, no matter how sophisticated, could ever perform. Any calculation that could be described as a step-by-step procedure could be carried out by this machine, given enough time and tape. He called it an automatic machine, but history would call it a Turing machine. This was profound. What Alan had done was define what computation actually meant. Before Turing, computation was a vague idea. You knew it when you saw it, but you couldn't quite pin it down. After Turing, computation had a precise mathematical definition. Something is computable if a Turing machine can do it. But Alan didn't stop there. He then imagined something even more remarkable, a universal Turing machine. This was a machine that could read a description of any other Turing machine from its tape and then simulate that machine. In other words, it was a single machine that could be programmed to behave like any other machine. Do you see what he'd invented? He'd invented the concept of the programmable computer. Before software was software, before hardware was hardware, Alan Turing looked at the question, what can be computed? And in answering it, accidentally sketched out the blueprint for every computer that would ever exist. His paper, On Computable Numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungsproblem, was published in 1936. Alan was 24 years old. Oh, and the answer to the Entscheidungsproblem? No. There is no mechanical procedure that can determine the truth of every mathematical statement. Alan proved that there are some things that are fundamentally undecidable, some questions that no computer, no matter how powerful, can ever answer. Let that sink in for a moment. At 24, Alan Turing defined what computers could do and proved what they could never do in a single stroke. An American mathematician named Alonzo Church had independently reached similar conclusions using a different method called lambda calculus. When Alan discovered this, he was initially disappointed. He thought he'd been scooped. But Church recognized that Alan's approach was more intuitive, more visual, more mechanical. Church's method was elegantly abstract. Alan's method was something you could almost imagine building. And that's exactly what Alan would do next. But first, he needed to learn some American engineering know-how. In 1936, Alan left Cambridge for Princeton University, where he worked with Church and other logicians. He spent 2 years there, earning a PhD and apparently building a strange machine in the basement of the mathematics, building a machine for multiplying numbers using electromagnetic relays. His fellow students remembered the sound of it, click, 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 echoing through the halls. While at Princeton, Alan also built what he called a digital multiplier and started thinking seriously about building machines that could actually compute. This wasn't just theory anymore. He was getting his hands dirty, learning how to make abstract mathematics into physical reality. But history was about to interrupt his research. In Europe, a madman had come to power. War was coming. And Britain was going to need all the brilliant minds it could find, even the awkward ones who wore gas masks while jogging. Especially those ones, as it turned out. Chapter 3. The Enigma Years. Britain's Secret Weapon. When Alan Turing returned to Britain in 1938, Europe was holding its breath. Hitler had annexed Austria. He'd seized Czechoslovakia. Everyone knew war was coming. They just didn't know when. The British government was preparing for the inevitable, and part of that preparation involved a rather unglamorous Victorian mansion in the countryside called Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park was Britain's code-breaking center, and in September of 1939, just days after Britain declared war on Germany, Alan Turing showed up there to start his new job. Or rather, to start doing something that couldn't officially be called a job because it was so secret that officially it didn't exist at all. The problem facing Britain was enormous. The Germans had a machine called Enigma that they used to encrypt all their military communications. And when I say encrypt, I mean it scrambled messages in ways that seemed absolutely unbreakable. Let me explain how Enigma worked, because it's actually quite clever. Imagine you have a typewriter, but instead of each key printing its own letter, the machine scrambles everything. Press A, and maybe you get Q. Press A again, and you get F. The machine had several rotating wheels called rotors, and with each keystroke, these wheels would turn, changing the encryption pattern. The number of possible settings was astronomical, over 150 million possibilities. The Germans were so confident in Enigma that they used it for everything: naval operations, army movements, air force deployments. They'd send encrypted messages, and even if the British intercepted them, which they did, the messages just looked like random gibberish. RGVWQPXLMODF and so on. The Poles had actually made significant progress on breaking Enigma before the war, and when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Polish cryptanalysts managed to smuggle their work to Britain and France. But the Germans kept making Enigma more complex, adding more rotors, changing their procedures. Every time the codebreakers caught up, the Germans pulled further ahead. Enter Alan Turing, professional awkward genius. Now, you have to understand that Bletchley Park was full of extraordinary people. There were linguists, chess champions, crossword puzzle experts, mathematicians basically. Britain had rounded up everyone who was good at patterns and puzzles and said, "Right, make yourselves useful." These people worked in various huts scattered around the estate, each hut assigned to different aspects of the code-breaking operation. Alan worked in Hut 8, which focused on German naval Enigma, and he approached the problem the way he approached everything, by thinking about it from first principles. The key insight was this: the Germans were lazy. Well, Not lazy exactly, but human. They had procedures, habits, patterns. Every morning, the German weather ships would send encrypted weather reports. Every message ended with Heil Hitler. These were called cribs, pieces of predictable text that appeared in encrypted messages. But knowing you had a crib wasn't enough. You still had to figure out which of those 150 million possible Enigma settings had been used to encrypt the message. Trying each one manually would take literally forever. So Alan designed a machine. He called it the Bombay, a name borrowed from the earlier Polish machine, the bomba. The Bombay was an electromechanical device that could test thousands of Enigma settings per minute. It worked by using logical contradictions. If assuming a particular Enigma setting led to an impossible situation, like a letter encrypting to itself, which Enigma couldn't do, then that setting could be eliminated. The first bomb, called Victory, was installed at Bletchley in March of 1940. It was about 7 feet tall, 2 feet deep, and over 6 feet wide. It made a terrible racket when it ran, like a room full of ladies knitting, according to one description. The rotating drums would spin, testing configuration after configuration, until if you were lucky it would stop, and you'd have a possible solution to check. The Bombay didn't decrypt messages directly. What it did was narrow down the possible Enigma settings to a manageable number that human codebreakers could test. It was a partnership between machine and human intelligence, each doing what it did best. And it worked. By the end of 1940, Bletchley Park was regularly reading German Enigma traffic. Naval Enigma was particularly important because German U-boats were devastating British shipping. Britain is an island. It imports most of its food and supplies. The U-boats were starving Britain into submission. But once Bletchley could read the U-boat messages, convoys could be routed around submarine wolf packs. Ships that would have been sunk made it through. The impact of this work can't be overstated. Historians estimate that breaking Enigma shortened the war by at least 2 years and saved millions of lives. Dwight Eisenhower later said that the intelligence from Bletchley Park was decisive to Allied victory. But here's the thing that gets me. Alan couldn't tell anyone. Not his friends, not his family, not the fellow mathematicians who wondered what he was doing stuck in some government facility in the countryside instead of publishing brilliant papers. The Official Secrets Act bound everyone at Bletchley to complete silence. The work had to remain secret not just during the war but for decades afterward, to protect Britain's continuing cryptographic capabilities. So Alan saved countless lives, helped win the war, and had to keep absolutely quiet about it. Life at Bletchley was surreal. By day, you were doing work of vital national importance, possibly the most important work of your life. By night, you were trying to sleep in drafty temporary housing while German bombers flew overhead. The codebreakers worked in shifts around the clock. The pressure was enormous. Every delay meant ships sunk, soldiers killed, families destroyed. Alan coped by being himself, which is to say, eccentric. He rode his bicycle to and from work, often in the middle of the night. The bicycle had a faulty chain that would slip off after a certain number of rotations, so Alan would count the pedal strokes and get off to adjust the chain before it slipped. This seemed perfectly logical to him. It apparently didn't occur to him to simply fix the chain permanently. He kept his coffee mug chained to the radiator, that story I mentioned earlier. Someone at Bletchley had been using his mug, and Alan's solution was to padlock it. When colleagues asked why he didn't just buy another mug, he looked at them as if they were the ones being ridiculous. He had a habit of running the 20 miles from Bletchley to London for important meetings because he didn't like waiting for trains. He'd show up at military intelligence headquarters, sweaty and slightly out of breath, ready to discuss cryptographic theory with admirals and generals. And through it all, he was brilliant. Not just at code breaking, but at thinking about information, about how systems work, about the relationship between problems and solutions. He wrote papers on mathematical theory during the war, though they wouldn't be published until afterward. He was already thinking about what would come next, thinking machines, artificial intelligence, the possibility of electronic computation. But there was also sadness. Alan had to hide a fundamental part of himself. He couldn't be open about being gay, even among people he trusted with secrets that could change the course of the war. In 1941, he got engaged to a woman named Joan Clark, a fellow codebreaker and one of the few people at Bletchley who was his intellectual equal. Joan later said that Alan told her he had homosexual tendencies before they got engaged, and she said it didn't matter to her. She cared about him, she valued his friendship, and if this was the way they could be together, she was willing. But Alan broke off the engagement a few months later. He couldn't go through with it. It wouldn't have been fair to Joan, and it wouldn't have been honest to himself. They remained friends, and by all accounts, Joan Clark was one of the few people who truly understood him. The war ended in 1945. Germany surrendered in May, Japan in August. The Bletchley codebreakers went home, took off their temporary uniforms, and tried to figure out what to do with themselves now that they couldn't talk about the most important work they'd ever done. Alan Turing was 33 years old. He'd helped save civilization, and now he wanted to build a brain. Chapter 4. The Manchester Engine and the Question of Thought. After the war, Alan could have gone back to Cambridge, settled into comfortable academic life, and quietly published papers on pure mathematics for the rest of his days. A lot of his colleagues did exactly that. But Alan had spent the war years building machines that could solve problems, and he'd realized something. The gap between his theoretical Turing machine and an actual physical computing device was no longer unbridgeable. Technology had caught up with imagination. In 1945, Alan went to work at the National Physical Laboratory in London, where he began designing what he called the Automatic Computing Engine, or ACE. This was going to be a real, physical, universal computing machine, his theoretical Turing machine made manifest in electronics and metal. Alan's design for the ACE was ambitious, elegant, and absolutely brilliant. It would use mercury delay lines for memory, yes, actual tubes of mercury that sound waves would travel through, storing information as acoustic pulses. It sounds insane now, but in 1946, it was cutting-edge technology. The design called for a machine that could execute instructions stored in its memory, could modify its own instructions, could be programmed to do essentially anything computable. It was the first truly modern computer architecture. But there was a problem. Alan was a better mathematician than he was a manager. He had trouble dealing with administrators, with budgets, with the endless committees and bureaucracy of government work. He wanted to build the machine, and everyone else wanted to have meetings about building the machine. For someone whose natural inclination was to simply start soldering things together and see what happened, the National Physical Laboratory was torture. By 1947, frustrated with the slow progress on the ACE, Alan left the NPL and accepted a position at the University of Manchester, where another computer pioneer, Max Newman, remember him from the Cambridge lectures, was building a computing laboratory. Manchester had something the NPL didn't, a small prototype computer that was actually working. It was called the Manchester Mark I, and it had successfully run its first program in June of 1948. This was exciting. This was what Alan had been waiting for, a real machine, not a plan or a proposal, but actual working hardware that could compute. But Alan wasn't interested in just building faster calculating machines. He wanted to explore something far more radical. Could machines think? In 1950, Alan published what might be his most famous paper outside of pure mathematics. It was called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, and it began with the most direct opening imaginable. I propose to consider the question, can machines think? Now, that question might seem straightforward, but Alan immediately recognized the problem. What does thinking even mean? We can't even define what thinking is when humans do it. So how can we possibly determine if a machine is doing it? So Alan proposed a test. He called it the imitation game, but history knows it as the Turing test. Here's how it works. Imagine you're sitting at a terminal, typing questions and receiving typed responses. You're having a conversation, but you can't see who or what you're talking to. It might be a human in another room. It might be a computer. Your job is to figure out which. If a computer can hold a conversation so well that you can't reliably tell whether you're talking to a machine or a person, then Alan argued it would be absurd to say the machine isn't thinking. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck and you can't distinguish it from a duck, then for all practical purposes it's a duck. This idea was radical. It still is. Alan wasn't asking whether machines could have consciousness or souls or subjective experiences. He was saying, let's focus on behavior, on capability, on what can actually be observed and measured. If a machine can intelligently respond to any question, solve problems, engage in conversation, be creative. If it can do all the things we associate with human intelligence, then the philosophical question of whether it really thinks is just semantic quibbling. The paper is wonderful to read, by the way. Alan anticipated every objection people might raise and addressed them one by one. People said, machines can only do what they're programmed to do. Alan replied, yes, but we're only doing what our genes and upbringing programmed us to do. The fact that behavior follows rules doesn't mean it's not intelligent. People said, machines can never be creative. Alan replied, have you ever written a program that surprised you with its output? I have. Complexity can emerge from simple rules. Besides, where does human creativity come from, if not from the complex interactions of simple neural processes? People said, machines don't have emotions. Alan replied, how do you know? More importantly, do you need emotions to think? Can't you reason about things without feeling anything about them? People said, machines can't be conscious. Alan replied, how do you know anyone else is conscious? You can't look inside their head. You only see their behavior and assume there's someone home. Give machines the same courtesy. It's a delightful paper, full of Alan's dry humor and clear thinking. At one point, he suggests that a thinking machine might need to be allowed to make mistakes, to be lazy occasionally, to be imperfect, because perfect accuracy is actually a sign of mechanical behavior, not intelligence. Real thinking is messy. He predicted that by the end of the century, by the year 2000, machines would be able to fool questioners about 30% of the time in a 5-minute conversation. We're not quite there yet, depending on how strictly you define the test, but we're getting close. But Alan wasn't just philosophizing. He was experimenting. At Manchester, he wrote some of the earliest programming manuals, explaining how to code for the Mark I. He wrote a program to play chess, working out the algorithm by hand because the computer wasn't quite powerful enough to run it yet. He worked on problems of morphogenesis, how patterns form in nature, how a zebra gets its stripes, how a sunflower arranges its seeds in spirals. This last bit of research was particularly fascinating. Alan was trying to understand how complexity emerges from simplicity, how mathematical rules could generate biological patterns. He published a paper on it in 1952 called The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis. It was far ahead of its time. The mathematical models he developed wouldn't be fully appreciated until decades later, when computers became powerful enough to simulate them properly. Alan was thinking about information, about how instructions, whether in DNA or in computer code, could generate complex behavior. He was thinking about the fundamental nature of computation, of intelligence, of life itself. He was, in his own quiet way, trying to figure out what makes us human. And in doing so, he was creating the field that would become artificial intelligence. But personal happiness eluded him. Alan had relationships with men as discreetly as he could manage in a society where his very nature was criminalized. He went to Norway on holiday, where attitudes were slightly more relaxed. He had affairs that had to be hidden, friendships that could never be fully open. And then, in January of 1952, Alan's house was burgled. It should have been a minor incident. Some things were stolen, The police were called. But in the course of the investigation, Alan admitted to having a relationship with another man, Arnold Murray, who was somehow connected to the burglar. And that's when Alan Turing's life fell apart. Chapter 5. The Persecution of a Hero. Let me tell you about British law in the 1950s. Under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, the same law that had destroyed Oscar Wilde's gross indecency between men was punishable by imprisonment. It didn't matter if the acts were consensual. It didn't matter if they occurred in private. It didn't matter if you'd saved your country and helped win a war. If you were gay, you were a criminal. When Alan Turing admitted to the police that he'd had a sexual relationship with Arnold Murray, he thought he was simply being honest. This was Alan all over. He saw no reason to lie about a fact. Yes, he'd slept with Murray. So what? Murray was an adult. It was consensual. Where was the crime? The police explained where the crime was. It was in his bed, in his house, in every moment of intimacy he'd shared with another man. Alan was charged with gross indecency. His trial was in March of 1952. Think about this for a moment. This was a man who had been trusted with Britain's most important wartime secrets. He'd been entrusted with information so sensitive that the government classified it as more secret than the invasion of Normandy. He'd worked side by side with military intelligence, with MI6, with the very highest levels of British security. His patriotism and discretion had never been questioned. But now, suddenly, because of whom he loved, he was a security risk. At his trial, Alan pleaded guilty. He didn't see what he'd done as wrong, but it was undeniably illegal, and Alan was fundamentally honest. He wouldn't pretend he was something he wasn't. He was offered a choice: prison or probation with treatment. The treatment was chemical castration. Let me be clear about what this meant. Alan would be given injections of synthetic estrogen female hormones to reduce his libido. The idea was that if they could suppress his sex drive, they could suppress his attraction to men. It was pseudoscientific nonsense, based on the assumption that homosexuality was a kind of disease that could be cured with the right drugs. The effects were devastating. Alan gained weight. He developed breasts. He became impotent. His brilliant mind was trapped in a body that was being chemically altered against its nature. Imagine having your very biology forcibly changed by the state, your body transformed into something alien, all because of whom you loved. And through all this, Alan continued to work. He continued his research on morphogenesis. He continued thinking about computation and intelligence. He kept going to the office, kept writing papers, kept trying to be the scientist he'd always been. But his security clearance was revoked. He couldn't work on classified projects anymore. The government he'd served so faithfully no longer trusted him. Trips abroad required special permission. He was watched. His phones might have been tapped. The message was clear: you are no longer one of us. Friends from Bletchley, people who'd worked alongside him during the war, weren't allowed to talk to him. The Official Secrets Act meant they couldn't even acknowledge what they'd done together. So Alan couldn't explain to curious colleagues why he'd spent the war years in the countryside. He couldn't defend himself against whispers that he'd avoided service, that he'd sat out the war. He had to stay silent about the very thing that should have made him a national hero. In 1953, Alan went on holiday to Greece. He'd always wanted to see the Mediterranean, to visit the places where ancient mathematicians had lived. But the police were suspicious. Why was a convicted homosexual traveling alone to Greece? What was he really doing there? They questioned him when he returned, suggesting he might be meeting foreign agents, selling secrets. The man who had kept Britain's secrets through the entire war was now suspected of treason because he'd gone on holiday. Alan tried to maintain his sense of humor about it all. When a friend asked how he was coping, he joked about the hormone treatments. "I'm growing breasts." He said it cheerfully, making light of his nightmare. But his friends could see the strain. He was becoming withdrawn, more isolated. He started consulting a psychiatrist, not because he thought there was anything wrong with being gay, but because he needed someone to talk to about the impossible situation he was in. The psychiatrist's notes declassified decades later show Alan wrestling with despair. He felt trapped. The hormone treatments would eventually end, but the conviction would follow him forever. He was branded now, marked as a criminal and a deviant. And yet, his mind kept working. In 1953 and 54, he continued his work on morphogenesis. He was working on problems in biology and chemistry, trying to understand how natural patterns formed. He was thinking about computability in physics, wondering if the universe itself operated according to computable rules, or if there was something fundamentally non-algorithmic about nature. These were the questions that fascinated him. What is information? What is computation? What is life? What is mind? He was trying to understand everything, and his own government was punishing him for being himself. On June 7, 1954, Alan's housekeeper found him dead in his bed. Next to him was a half-eaten apple. The autopsy revealed cyanide poisoning. The inquest ruled it suicide. Alan had apparently taken potassium cyanide, possibly by lacing the apple with it, though the apple itself was never tested. He was 41 years old. Chapter 6. The question that remains. There are people who don't believe Alan Turing killed himself. They point out inconsistencies in the investigation. They note that Alan had been making plans for the future. He'd invited friends for dinner that week. He'd left a to-do list for upcoming work. They observe that Alan had set up a small chemistry experiment in his home and was known to be careless about washing his hands after handling chemicals. Could it have been an accident? His mother believed it was an accident until the day she died. She couldn't accept that her son would take his own life, not her Alan, who'd always been so curious about the world, so eager to see what came next. But I think we have to face the likelihood that it was suicide. Because when you look at what Alan Turing endured in those final 2 years, the public humiliation, the chemical castration, the loss of his security clearance, the betrayal by the country he'd served, the constant surveillance, the knowledge that he would never be accepted for who he was, when you consider all of that, suicide doesn't seem like a mystery. It seems like a tragedy that was allowed to happen. Alan Turing was persecuted by his own government for being gay. That's the simple, brutal truth. And that persecution killed him, whether directly or indirectly. His death was reported in a few newspapers, briefly. Most stories mentioned that he was a mathematician and had done some kind of war work. The Official Secrets Act meant that what he'd actually accomplished at Bletchley Park couldn't be revealed, so the obituaries were thin, vague. A brilliant mathematician had died young. Very sad. Moving on. Except we didn't move on. We should have, but we didn't. Because Alan's work was too important, too foundational, too transformative to simply disappear. The computers he'd envisioned kept being built. The field of artificial intelligence he'd helped create kept developing. The questions he'd asked about computation and intelligence kept being explored by new generations of researchers who often didn't even know his name. In 1966, the Association for Computing Machinery created the Turing Award, their highest honor, given annually to someone who's made lasting contributions to computing. It's the computer science equivalent of the Nobel Prize. They named it for a man whose contributions most people still didn't know about, because those contributions were classified. In 1974, the British government finally admitted that there had been a code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park during the war. Slowly, carefully, with enormous reluctance, the Official Secrets Act began to loosen its grip. Veterans of Bletchley could finally talk about what they'd done. Books were written, the story started to emerge. And people realized that mathematician who died sadly in 1954, he'd helped win the war, he'd saved countless lives, he'd been a hero. But Britain had destroyed him anyway. In 2009, Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued an official apology on behalf of the British government. He called the treatment of Alan Turing appalling and said, "We're sorry, you deserved so much better." In 2013, Alan Turing received a posthumous royal pardon for his conviction. In 2017, the British government passed what's informally called the Turing Law, pardoning all men convicted under historical laws against homosexuality. These gestures matter. They're important, but they're also desperately inadequate, aren't they? Because Alan Turing is still dead. He died at 41, alone, probably in despair, in a world that should have celebrated him but instead persecuted him. Every time you unlock your phone, you're using technology that descended from concepts Alan Turing developed. Every time you talk to a voice assistant, you're engaging with AI research that traces back to his paper on machine intelligence. Every time you send an encrypted message, you're relying on principles of cryptography that he helped establish. Alan Turing is everywhere in our modern world. His ideas permeate our technology, our science, our understanding of computation and intelligence. We live in a world that Alan imagined before anyone else could see it. And yet, for most of his life, and for decades after his death, he was forgotten, dismissed, or deliberately obscured. Chapter 7. The Legacy We Almost Lost. Let's talk about what would have happened if Alan Turing had lived. He would have been 41 in 1954. Still young, still brilliant, still full of ideas. The chemical castration treatments had ended in 1953. His body would have eventually recovered. What might he have accomplished with another 20, 30, 40 years? We were on the cusp of the computer revolution. The transistor had been invented in 1947. Integrated circuits would come in the late 1950s. Programming languages were being developed. The groundwork was being laid for everything that would follow. Personal computers, the internet, artificial intelligence, smartphones, all of it. Alan Turing could have been there for all of it. He could have guided the development of AI from its infancy. He could have watched his theoretical machines become everyday tools. He could have seen the Turing test become a real challenge that researchers were actively trying to meet. Instead, we lost him, just as the field he'd helped create was beginning to blossom. But let's also talk about what we didn't lose. Because here's the remarkable thing about Alan's work. It was so fundamental, so mathematically rigorous, so correct that it survived even when he didn't. The concept of the Turing machine became the foundation of theoretical computer science. Every computer science student learns about Turing machines. They're the starting point for understanding computation, complexity, decidability, all the big questions in the field. The Church-Turing thesis, the idea that anything computable can be computed by a Turing machine, remains the working assumption of computer science. It's never been proven in the formal sense, but it's never been disproven either. Every model of computation anyone has ever invented turns out to be equivalent to a Turing machine in terms of what it can compute. The Turing test remains the benchmark for artificial intelligence. We've developed more sophisticated measures since, but whenever someone wants to talk about whether machines can think, they start with Turing's imitation game. It frames the conversation. And the work he did at Bletchley? That legacy is more complicated because it was secret for so long. But the techniques developed there, the idea of using machines to break codes, the intersection of mathematics and military intelligence, all of that shaped how signals intelligence evolved in the Cold War and beyond. Alan Turing's fingerprints are all over the modern world, even if most people who benefit from his work don't know his name. But here's what keeps me up at night. How many other Alan Turings have we lost? How many brilliant minds have been silenced, sidelined, or destroyed because of prejudice, because of bigotry, because society decided that who someone loved or what they looked like or where they came from mattered more than what they could contribute. Alan was lucky in some ways. He was white, male, educated, from a professional family. He had access to Cambridge, to Bletchley Park, to research positions. Imagine if he'd been born female in 1912. Would she have been allowed to study mathematics at Cambridge? Would she have been recruited to Bletchley? We'd like to think so, but history suggests otherwise. Imagine if he'd been black, or poor, or from a colonized country. Would his genius have been recognized and nurtured, or would it have been wasted because society never gave him a chance? We know the answer. We know that for every Alan Turing who succeeded despite society's prejudices, there were countless others who didn't. And that's a loss we can't even measure because we don't know what was never created, what ideas were never born, what problems were never solved. Alan Turing's story is a reminder that prejudice isn't just morally wrong, it's stupid. It's wasteful. It deprives us all of the contributions people could make if we just let them. Chapter 8. The Man Behind the Mathematics. I want to close tonight by trying to imagine Alan as a person, not just as a historical figure or a mathematical genius. Because it's easy to turn people into icons, into symbols, and in doing so, forget that they were human beings who laughed and worried and got frustrated and felt joy. Alan Turing liked to run. We've mentioned this, but it bears emphasizing because it tells us something important about him. He wasn't running to get somewhere, he had a bicycle for that, faulty chain and all. He ran because he enjoyed it, because it cleared his mind, because there was something satisfying about the rhythm of it. He ran marathons. He ran in terrible weather. Once, during a race, he stopped to have tea with his mother who lived along the route, then continued running. He had a high-pitched voice and a stammer when he got excited about something. Colleagues remembered that when Alan was explaining an idea he found particularly interesting, the words would tumble out faster and faster. His voice would rise, and he'd sometimes have to stop and restart sentences because his mouth couldn't keep up with his brain. He was terrible at small talk, genuinely awful at it. At dinner parties, he would fall silent unless the conversation turned to something he found interesting, at which point he would suddenly become animated and talk at length about whatever had caught his attention: mathematical logic, the behavior of plants, whether machines could think. And then, when the conversation moved on to something mundane, he'd lapse back into quiet. He had a few very close friends, people who understood him and accepted his eccentricities. Joan Clark was one. Don Bailey, a Bletchley colleague, was another. These people saw past the awkwardness to the kindness underneath. Because Alan was kind. He was patient with people who didn't understand mathematics. He was generous with his time when someone genuinely wanted to learn something. He loved fairy tales and science fiction. He'd read works by authors imagining futures with thinking machines and wonder whether those futures could actually happen. He thought about whether we could build a machine that could learn, could grow, could develop personality. He kept irregular hours, often working late into the night when an idea seized him, then sleeping until noon. His office at Manchester was apparently a chaotic mess of papers, books, and half-disassembled equipment. But Alan knew where everything was in that chaos. It had its own logic, comprehensible to him if to no one else. He could be funny. His humor was dry and unexpected. When someone asked him why he was interested in building thinking machines, he replied that it would be nice to have something intelligent to talk to. When asked whether machines could ever write good poetry, he said he didn't know, but that most people couldn't either, so machines would be in good company. And he was lonely. Let's not pretend otherwise. Alan spent much of his life feeling like an outsider, like someone observing human society from a distance. The loneliness of genius is real, but so is the loneliness of having to hide who you are. Alan experienced both. He wanted to be loved and accepted for himself. He wanted to do good work and be recognized for it. He wanted to understand the world and how it worked. These are universal desires. There was nothing alien about Alan Turing's wants and needs. He just happened to be gay in a society that criminalized it, and brilliant in a way that made him difficult for ordinary people to understand. Near the end of his life, Alan wrote to a friend, "I'm afraid that the following syllogism may be used by some in the future. Turing believes machines think. Turing lies with men. Therefore, machines do not think." He was joking, sort of. But the joke reveals something painful. Alan knew that his sexuality could be used to discredit his scientific work. He knew that people's prejudice against him could poison their view of his ideas. He feared that his legacy would be tainted by bigotry, Thankfully, he was wrong about that. His ideas were too good, too fundamental, too correct to be dismissed. The mathematics didn't care about his sexuality. The logic didn't care about whom he loved. The machines he imagined didn't care about anything except whether the instructions they were given were logically coherent. Alan Turing's great gift to us was showing that computation, intelligence, and problem-solving could be understood through abstract formal systems. That mind could be, in some sense, separated from matter. That thinking was a kind of information processing that could, in principle, be replicated in any substrate capable of performing the right operations. This idea is now so fundamental to how we think about computers and brains that it's hard to imagine there was a time before it, but there was, and Alan Turing was the one who saw it first. We've spent tonight exploring the life of a man who saw the future before anyone else could imagine it. A man who helped save his country and was destroyed by it. A man who was, in the end, simply trying to understand what it means to think, to compute, to be intelligent. Alan Turing died 70 years ago, and yet he feels oddly contemporary. The questions he asked are the questions we're still asking. Can machines think? What is consciousness? Can intelligence be separated from biological wetware? These aren't historical curiosities, they're the cutting edge of modern AI research. Every time we marvel at what AI can do, every time we worry about what it might become, we're having a conversation that Alan started in 1950. When we wonder whether large language models are really intelligent or just very good at pattern matching, we're returning to his question about the imitation game. Does it matter what's happening inside the system, or does behavior tell us everything we need to know? Alan would have loved to see the modern world. He would have been fascinated by neural networks, by deep learning, by machines that can write poetry and generate art and play games at superhuman levels. He would have asked difficult questions about how they work and whether we're building them correctly. And he probably would have been most interested in the cases where they fail, where they produce nonsense or exhibit bizarre behavior, because failures tell you about limitations and assumptions. But I also think Alan would be disappointed in us. Not for the technology we've built, he'd be thrilled about that. But for the fact that we're still arguing about whether LGBTQ people deserve equal rights. That in many parts of the world, being gay is still criminalized. That prejudice and bigotry still destroy lives. Alan Turing's persecution wasn't some ancient history. It was 70 years ago. There are people alive today who remember it. And while Britain has apologized and pardoned him, the apology doesn't undo the harm. It doesn't bring him back. It doesn't give him the decades of research he could have done, the problems he could have solved, the students he could have mentored. We can't fix what was done to Alan Turing, but we can honor his memory by refusing to repeat those mistakes. We can build a world where brilliant people are celebrated for their contributions, not persecuted for who they love. We can create spaces where genius can flourish, regardless of gender, race, sexuality, or background. We can remember that diversity isn't just morally right, it's scientifically necessary, because the best ideas come from the widest possible range of perspectives. Alan Turing gave us the computer age. He gave us the framework for thinking about artificial intelligence. He gave us tools that shaped the modern world, and all he asked in return was to be allowed to be himself. We failed him, but we don't have to fail the next person, or the person after that. So tonight, as you go home and use your computers and smartphones, and all the technology that descended from Alan's ideas, take a moment to remember the man behind it all. The awkward, brilliant, kind, lonely mathematician who saw further than anyone else and paid a terrible price for being different. Remember Alan Matheson Turing. Remember what we owe him. And remember what we owe everyone who comes after. The chance to contribute, to create, to think, to be themselves without fear. That's his legacy. Not just the mathematics and the machines, but the reminder that every person matters, that every mind is valuable, and that prejudice is not just morally wrong but catastrophically wasteful. Good night, Alan. We wish you'd been with us longer. We wish we'd treated you better. We wish you could see what your ideas became. And we promise to do better for those who come after. Good night. And in case you've enjoyed our evening talk so much and still might be awake, here is another educational video for you.